Stacy again. The topic that we want to cover here is separation anxiety. Now, it's really hard with rescues to kind of slap a label of separation anxiety on a dog because they are coming out of a really stressful situation. So I want to talk about separation anxiety, but I don't necessarily want to give you the impression that even a dog that's showing signs of separation anxiety, that is necessarily what it is. We're going to treat it like separation anxiety because that's the best way to kind of help them get to the other side of it. But it could be that the dog is just really, really struggling much more than most to kind of come back to the other side of their traumatic event of, being abandoned or just being at the shelter or whatever. So with that disclaimer, signs of separation anxiety or isolation distress could be as mild as whining or pacing or even intermittent barking, but can go all the way to, self-mutilation, pottying, even though they're potty trained in either their crate or if you have them in a containment area, going potty in those areas. And everything in between. A lot of dogs won't eat when you're gone. A lot of separation anxiety dogs or dogs that are really stressed with isolation will avoid eating. They might chew and scratch around if they're in the crate, obviously the crate door, but if they're in a containment area, they might scratch or chew around entry or exit points to try to get out. And then if they got out from there, they'd go for the front door or window or something like that. So those are kind of common things to look out for. When talking about separation anxiety, it's important to kind of frame that in that the dog is having a panic attack, has no ability to cope with being alone. And often these are dogs who have separation anxiety. It is kind of a hereditary thing. That they are more likely or predisposition to have separation anxiety, but that it is triggered by a really stressful event. So pretty much our fosters fall in that category of a really stressful event happening for the most part. So, that's kind of why we see it a lot. Also, I feel like, a lot of separation anxiety can be a tedious thing to work with. And so I think a lot of owners maybe do send their dogs to a shelter or a rescue as a result because they just don't feel equipped to work with it. So that's something to keep in mind. The dog isn't being bad or getting back at you for leaving or, actually having accidents in the house if they are. It's not a potty training issue. It's like they're panicking to the extent that they're losing control over it. So hopefully that will build a little bit of compassion. I know that it can be frustrating for a lot of people, but it is, it is something that we can have success with for working them through it. So where to start with that? The biggest place to start is just giving your dog a few days of decompression. So again, what we see in the first few days may not be lasting. So we don't want to make a bigger deal of it than it actually is. So if in the first 3 days the dog is unable to be alone, let's work on some decompression exercises. Let's work on teaching them the boundary. Let's work on some enrichment activities to get that dog kind of in a more settled frame of mind. Then after, you know, if some of that separation or isolation distress is still around, then we can start saying, okay, well, let's come up with a plan for this individual dog. So the thing with separation anxiety is that as long as you're leaving the dog alone in a way that they feel uncomfortable, the anxiety is going to continue or will grow. They can't get over the separation anxiety when they're still experiencing it. And so that, my friends, is what makes it so difficult to get over it. Now, so what I would recommend is finding another foster that lives close to you, or recruiting a friend to be a foster, even if it's just for this one dog. They'll still have to sign up through Peak Lab, but as you know, the foster application is super quick. But do make a concerted effort to not leave the dog alone outside of its threshold. So if the dog can be alone for 10 minutes, leaving it for 15 minutes ends up being a bad experience. So what we want to do is we want to see where the dog is starting out. So if he can be alone for 10 minutes, great, we'll start at 10 minutes and grow that in a gradual way so that the dog actually starts beginning to see being alone as something that they can cope with, and you know, not this big negative scary thing. Okay, so a stronger crate is not going to fix the underlying emotions. A shock collar or a bark collar is not going to fix the underlying emotions. Those things are just containing either the damage in the case of the crate that your dog can do, or in the case of the bark collar or shock collar, is just suppressing their outward expression of those. And sometimes that can really, really backfire because, you know, I'm scared and anxious to be alone, and when I bark, then I get, you know, a correction, and, you know, that can spiral the anxiety, and it can suppress the barking, sure, but then those dogs can sometimes turn into doing things like self-mutilation, you know, licking, until they get hot spots, or like even chewing on a paw or something like that. So we just really want to make sure that our end goal is to change the underlying emotions, give the dog the tools to cope with being alone independently, right? So you want that like kind of confidence in being alone. You want a little bit of independence there. So those will be the things that we would work on through training. The best way to determine what a particular dog can handle as far as being alone goes is to get a baseline video. And so what you would do is leave the dog, and if it's okay with the crate, then leave the dog in the crate. And if not, try to find an area where you can contain them a little bit and see if that's more successful. A lot of dogs that have separation anxiety also have containment anxiety, and some dogs that present as separation anxiety just have containment anxiety. So as soon as you let them out of the crate and let them kind of roam in part of the house, they're fine. So that would be considered containment anxiety, and you can work through that and get them used to a crate. But some dogs, if they're not doing any damage in their house, if they're not a puppy and they're not chewing or having accidents, then you can just not put them in the crate as a solution for containment anxiety. But for separation anxiety, often the crate makes it worse, incidentally. And so that's really hard for us fosters, because like me, I have cats. So I don't want to leave a dog, you know, in my kitchen because, you know, if the cats go in there and something happens when I'm not here, that's not okay. So, you know, it can be harder as a foster, as you know, because this dog isn't your own. But you got to try to make it work. And having a foster partner can really reduce the stress of that. So anyways, taking a baseline video, see where your dog is at now. Frequently, the dog is able to stay alone a lot shorter time than you might think. So you can use Skype, FaceTime. A lot of people don't have cameras, and that's perfectly fine. You can just use 2 cell phones and watch the dog. See when you start seeing the dog move from I'm okay to I'm keeping it together to I'm losing it. And sometimes it's only seconds or minutes, and some dogs you can't even get out the door. So those are just, it's all good information to have, and they're all just your starting point. And then from there you can kind of build. And I really recommend that you work with either Jane Howard or I on coming up with a plan for the particular dog. It is a really precise thing. So you'll need a little bit of guidance to get through it. It's not a hard thing, it's just kind of a tedious thing. And if you are leaving your dog beyond their threshold of when they're not keeping it together any longer, then those negative experiences are just piling up, and so your dog is not going to get better in that situation. Now, when a dog gets adopted and moves to his new home, likely there will be a regression. So there is some argument of whether a foster should even work on the safe departures or not, because we do tend to have the fosters for such a short time, and because there will likely be a regression. So if it's not something you want to work on, that's fine, but still get a foster partner and still don't leave the dog alone outside of what it's comfortable with. So for most dogs, that will be not at all. So you would have to leave it with a family member, leave it with another foster, just so that you are, instead of, filling the dog's stress bucket, you're kind of allowing the decompression to continue. And that will really help with other behavioral areas that you might be experiencing as well. The dog will just be more settled if they're not having that stress of having to be left alone. Okay, so teaching a boundary, again, really helps with building calm independence. Enrichment activities might include even just going for walks, honestly. Going for walks, allow them to sniff. Scatter feed. Scatter feeding is just like, you can just like throw a part of their portion of food in the grass and let them sniff around and find it. Anything to do with smelling or sniffing stuff is going to build optimism in the dog. And it seems really weird, but it's related to when they're sniffing, their body secretes dopamine, so it puts them in a better place. So you want to really encourage things like that. Any filled Kongs or puzzle games, or even just some training, all of those things will increase confidence and be enriching for the dog. And play with the dog, give them some positive place to be in their headspace, so that they're not always afraid that somebody's gonna leave them. Make life enriching and fun for them. So those are the basics of just where you need to start with separation anxiety, remembering that a stronger crate isn't the answer. If you do the safe absence protocol, the whole point of that protocol is to keep the dog under threshold. So I know it's scary to think of like a dog with separation anxiety loose in your house, but remember you're videoing them. And as you can start seeing their stress, the first indications of stress in the dog, you would come back in. So it's not like you would leave them for a prescribed time that would be outside of what they could handle. Remember, we're keeping it below that. So that's just something to keep in mind. And again, that's kind of a precise thing. And so we want to make sure that you work with somebody who's gone through that process before. So let me know if you have any questions. Separation anxiety is kind of a big thing. We do have some documentation, places to start in the files section. So, you know, if you want some stuff that's written down, there's that. And obviously, if you have questions, reach out. Thanks.